Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about Samuel, the poisoner of Charleston, the enslaved man who killed 12 of his masters during a 4th of July celebration that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the suffocating, liquid heat of a Charleston summer, on the 4th day of July, the very air seemed to hold its breath, thick with the scent of jasmine and impending doom. It was a day meant for celebration, a day consecrated to the nascent ideal of liberty, where the sky was meant to burst with the fleeting glory of fireworks, not echo with the silent, internal screams of the dying. On the sprawling veranda of the Thompson estate, a whitewashed temple of colonial prosperity, the clinking of imported crystal and the murmur of genteel conversation painted a masterpiece of idyllic power. Laughter, delicate and sharp, echoed across manicured lawns, a sound as bright and brittle as the porcelain plates laden with roasted meats, glistening jellies, and summer delicacies. Yet, beneath this shimmering, meticulously constructed facade of joy, a venomous secret was beginning to unspool. A thread of darkness woven invisibly into the very fabric of the feast. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A discordant note in a flawless symphony. A guest, the merchant Silas Blackwood, a man known for his booming laugh and ruthless business dealings, suddenly fell silent. His face, moments before flushed with wine and self-satisfaction, paled to a sickly, waxy sheen. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. He clutched at his stomach, a grimace of profound confusion twisting his features before he slumped forward, his heavy body crashing against the table. His wineglass, a fine piece from Venetian artisans, shattered on the polished floorboards. The sound sharp and shocking in the sudden lull. A woman shrieked, a high, piercing sound of distress. But her cry was quickly swallowed by a second, strangled gasp from across the table. Eleanor Vance, a planter's wife famed for a beauty that poets compared to the pale magnolia, was now gasping for air, her delicate, gloved hands clawing at her throat as if trying to pull an invisible serpent from within. Panic, cold and sharp as a surgeon's knife, began to slice through the warm, festive air. It was no longer a single, unfortunate incident, one by one. Then, in a horrifying, undeniable cascade, the guests began to fall. An elderly dowager, known for her sharp tongue, simply closed her eyes and ceased to be. A young officer, his uniform immaculate, writhed on the ground, his cries for help turning into a choked gurgle. The patriarch, Judge Alastair Thompson himself, a man whose word was law and whose gaze could quell a courtroom, rose to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief. He opened his mouth to restore order, but only a final choked utterance escaped his lips before he collapsed, his eyes wide with a primordial terror that saw something far beyond the mortal realm. The other enslaved servants, frozen in place against the walls, watched this horror unfold with wide, unblinking eyes, their own fear a complex tapestry of shock and a terrifying, unspoken understanding. To move was to invite suspicion. To stay still was to witness the apocalypse of their masters. Within the hour, the grand celebration had transformed into a charnel house. 12 souls, the very cream of Charleston society, lay dead or dying amidst the ruins of the feast. There were no wounds, no signs of overt violence, only the grotesque, silent tableau of bodies contorted in unspeakable agony. Dr. R.S. Thorne, the local physician, summoned in a frenzy, moved through the scene with a growing sense of dread. He saw the telltale signs, the cyanotic tinge of the lips, the fixed and dilated pupils, the rigid clenching of muscles. These were the symptoms of a swift and brutal poison. But its origin was a terrifying, profound mystery. As the sun set, casting long, blood-red shadows across the once joyful scene, a single word began to circulate in hushed, terrified whispers among the survivors. A word that would curdle the blood of every master in the city: poison. The 4th of July, a day celebrating the birth of a nation's freedom, had become the stage for a massacre born from the absolute absence of it. To understand the chilling precision of the evil that bloomed on that day, one must first understand the soil in which its seeds were sown. Charleston, in the early 19th century, was not merely a city. It was a gilded fortress, a paradise built upon the bedrock of human suffering. It was the undisputed jewel of the American South. Its elegant avenues lined with grand mansions draped in jasmine and wisteria, their pastel facades hiding interiors of opulent mahogany and imported silk. The air, thick with the sweet scent of magnolia and the salty tang of the nearby Atlantic, carried the chimes of St. Michael's church bells and the distant, rhythmic songs of dock workers loading rice and cotton onto ships bound for Europe. But this beauty was a meticulously crafted illusion, a mask for a brutal, deeply paranoid reality. The city's immense wealth, its very existence, was extracted from the blood, sweat, and stolen lives of the tens of thousands of enslaved Africans who toiled in its homes and on the surrounding plantations. The fear of insurrection was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of polite society, a fear stoked by news of revolts in the Caribbean and the failed plot of Denmark Vesey, just a few years prior, right there in their own streets. The society was a rigid, unyielding pyramid of power, codified by law and enforced by the lash. At its apex were the planter and merchant aristocrats, families like the Thompsons, who lived lives of unimaginable luxury and wielded absolute authority. They saw themselves as benevolent patriarchs, paragons of a divinely ordained order, governing their property with a firm but righteous hand. This was a self-serving and necessary delusion, according to the private journals of travelers and the grim, emotionless records of the time. The system was maintained by a culture of pervasive psychological fear. The constant threat of the whip, the branding iron, and the auction block was the true currency of control. Public floggings were common spectacles in the city square. And the slave patrols, armed groups of white men, roamed the nights, a constant, menacing reminder that any dream of freedom would be extinguished with ruthless, exemplary violence. Life for the enslaved was a state of perpetual psychological siege. They were stripped of their names, their families, their religions, and their very humanity. Legally defined as chattel, no different from livestock or furniture. Yet, within this profoundly dehumanizing system, a vibrant and resilient culture persisted in the shadows, in the cramped, stifling quarters behind the grand houses. They preserved their traditions through whispered stories, forbidden songs, and a deep, shared knowledge of the land itself, a knowledge that the white man, in his arrogance, had failed to recognize as power. They knew the secrets of the coastal Low Countries flora, which roots could heal a fever, which leaves could soothe a wound, and which berries, flowers, or seeds, if prepared with careful, patient intent, could bring about a swift and silent end. This hidden world of botanical knowledge, invisible and utterly dismissed by the masters who believed themselves omniscient, was the only domain where the enslaved held any true power. It was a silent, growing arsenal, an ancestral science waiting for a hand steady enough and a heart cold enough to wield it within the suffocating confines of the Thompson estate. Two figures occupied the opposite ends of this brutal spectrum of power, their lives inextricably and fatally intertwined. The first was Judge Alastair Thompson, the patriarch, a man in his late 50s. He was the very embodiment of Charleston's planter aristocracy, proud, publicly pious, and privately unforgiving. He considered his authority not merely a right, but a sacred duty ordained by God. He never raised his own hand to strike a slave. That was crude work for overseers, but his orders, delivered in a calm, measured tone over a glass of Madeira, could shatter a family, sending a husband to the rice fields of the deep south or a child to the auction block in the city square without a moment's hesitation. He believed his slaves were content, even grateful for his paternalistic care. A willful blindness so profound it would prove to be his undoing. The other figure was Samuel. To Judge Thompson and his family, Samuel was little more than a piece of efficient, silent machinery, the finest in their collection of human property. He was the head butler, a position of considerable trust and intimacy. He moved through the grand house like a ghost, his presence so constant it became invisible. He was privy to the family's most intimate conversations, their most secret dealings, their most casual cruelties, all of which he absorbed with a face as placid and unreadable as still, deep water. The Thompsons noted his intelligence and his quiet dignity, qualities they found convenient, never once considering them to be signs of a deep and complex inner world, a soul simmering with a rage they could not comprehend. They did not know that Samuel, brought from the sugar plantations of the Caribbean as a boy, carried with him a knowledge passed down through generations, a mastery of botany and chemistry that the finest physicians in Charleston could not begin to comprehend. In the months leading up to that fateful July, a subtle change had come over Samuel, a shift in his very essence so slight it went entirely unnoticed by his masters. The quiet deference in his eyes was replaced by a watchful, unnerving intensity. His movements, always precise, became imbued with an almost ritualistic deliberation. He spent more of his rare free moments in the swamps and forests bordering the estate, gathering herbs, roots, and fungi, a practice the overseer dismissed as harmless folk medicine for the other slaves. No one saw the cold, calculating fury that was crystallizing in his heart, forged by 1,000 daily humiliations. No one recognized the quiet signs of a rebellion being planned, not a rebellion of fire and blades, but a far more terrifying one, a rebellion that would be served on a silver platter, a reckoning that would rise from the very earth the masters claimed to own. The most dangerous man on the Thompson estate was not a rival planter or a political foe. He was the man who poured their wine. The arrival of the city watch shattered the eerie, unnatural silence that had descended upon the Thompson estate. They came not with the quiet reverence befitting a house of mourning, but with the heavy, clattering boots and loud, panicked voices of men confronting a horror that dwarfed their authority. Their lanterns cut crude, dancing circles into the deepening twilight, revealing the grotesque tableau on the veranda in stark, horrifying flashes. They saw a scene of mass death among the city's most powerful citizens, and their minds, conditioned by a society built on fear, immediately sought the simplest, most familiar explanation: an escaped slave, a rival merchant's tainted shipment of wine, a foreign plot hatched in the taverns by the docks. Any theory was preferable to the chilling alternative, the one that whispered from the deepest, most paranoid recesses of their collective soul that the enemy was already inside the fortress. while the watch captain barked orders, securing the grounds and clumsily questioning the hysterical, weeping survivors. Dr. Ariston continued his grim, methodical work. His scientific curiosity was a small, defiant island of reason in an ocean of burgeoning chaos, with a small lens and delicate instruments. He examined the victims, his face a mask of intense concentration. He noted the uniformity of the symptoms, the terrifying speed with which life had been extinguished. A crucial observation began to form in his mind, a detail that the watch, in their frantic search for a visible culprit, had overlooked. Only those seated at the main table, the inner circle closest to Judge Thompson, had been afflicted. The guests at smaller, surrounding tables, who had eaten the same food, were unharmed, and more importantly, the enslaved servants, who had tasted every dish in the kitchen, as was the custom to prevent this very occurrence, were perfectly well. It was not the food. It was something else. Something targeted with the precision of a master strategist. This initial finding, delivered in a low, urgent tone to the captain of the watch, was the first stone cast into the placid waters of the city's assumptions. This was not a random act of malice. This was a series of assassinations, executed with a terrifying and intimate knowledge of the household. The conflict was no longer about finding a simple, brutish culprit, but about confronting a cold, calculating intelligence. In the days that followed this realization, Charleston transformed. The thin veneer of genteel civility cracked and fell away, revealing a bedrock of raw, primal fear. A suffocating paranoia descended upon the city, thicker and more oppressive than the summer humidity. Every master now looked at their servants not as subservient property, but as potential assassins. Every meal became an object of suspicion. Every poured drink a potential vessel of death. According to records from the period, sales of locks, pistols, and iron bars for windows skyrocketed. The lash fell more frequently and with greater fury in the slave quarters across the city, as masters tried to beat a confession out of the pervasive terror. Desperate to find a face for the faceless threat that now lived, breathed, and served in their own homes, amidst this rising tide of public hysteria and private terror, Magistrate Elias Davies was officially tasked with uncovering the truth. Davies was a man apart from the panicked aristocracy. He was a creature of cold logic, a student of the law who believed every crime was a complex puzzle that could be methodically solved by the careful application of reason and evidence. He was immune to the city's wild, panicked theories of vast conspiracies and foreign agents. He began his investigation when a tragedy had ended at the Thompson estate, which now stood silent and shuttered, a grand monument to the city's shattered sense of security. He decided to methodically interrogate every surviving member of the household staff, one by one, in the cold, impersonal formality of his office downtown, far from the influence and intimidation of the plantation. He faced a wall of terrified, unyielding silence. The enslaved servants, caught in the impossible vice between the certain wrath of their owners and the unknown fear of the true killer, offered nothing but trembling denials and wide-eyed professions of ignorance. Their testimonies were flawless, identical, a perfectly rehearsed chorus of fear and sorrow. They had seen nothing, heard nothing, suspected nothing. Yet, through this parade of terrorized souls, Magistrate Davies noted one stark, unsettling exception, Samuel, when the head butler was brought before him. There was no trembling, no averted gaze, no stammered pleas of innocence. Samuel stood before the magistrate with a calm, almost serene, deference. His account of the day was precise, detailed, and utterly devoid of any discernible emotion. He recounted the sequence of events with the dispassionate clarity of a clockmaker describing the workings of a timepiece. He was On the surface, the perfect witness. And yet, his very perfection was profoundly unsettling. Davies, a man who prided himself on his ability to read the souls of men, felt he was not questioning a person, but a perfectly constructed mask. As the political pressure from the city's surviving elite mounted for an arrest, any arrest to quell the panic, Davies found himself with no weapon, no motive, and only one deeply enigmatic person of interest. The investigation was stalled, frozen by the same cold, invisible, and intelligent hand that had served death on that 4th of July. Dr. Thorne, meanwhile, had not been idle. He had retreated from the chaos of the city to the quiet sanctity of his small, cluttered laboratory, a room filled with the scent of chemicals and drying herbs. Working relentlessly by candlelight late into the night, he had managed to isolate a minute crystalline residue from the dregs of Judge Thompson's personal wine decanter. The process was painstaking. He used alcohol to dissolve the substance, carefully filtering it through fine linen, then slowly evaporating the liquid until only a few shimmering, needle-like crystals remained. They were beautiful, and they were terrifying. His notes from the time, written in a precise, frantic script, describe a substance of almost unimaginable potency. A single grain, smaller than a speck of dust, was dissolved in water and administered to a caged rat. The result was horrifyingly swift. The creature's death mirrored the human victim's symptoms with an exact, sickening accuracy. The initial confusion, the rapid paralysis of the limbs, the final, silent convulsion. He could not identify the plant from which it came. Its complex chemistry was unlike anything in his European medical texts. But he knew, with the certainty of a man of science staring into the abyss, that he was dealing with a botanical poison of immense and terrifying sophistication. This was not the work of a common criminal. It was the work of a master. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was not from a forced confession or a new piece of physical evidence, but from a whisper of forgotten lore, a journey into a world of knowledge that men like Davies and Thorne had long dismissed, frustrated and at a dead end. Dr. Thorne sought the counsel of Abraham Postel, a retired botanist living in self-imposed seclusion miles outside the city. Postel was an eccentric, a man who had spent more of his life in the swamps and forests of the colonies than in the drawing rooms of Charleston, and was known for his unorthodox interest in the folk remedies and root work of the enslaved population. Thorne found him in a dusty study, surrounded by pressed flowers and arcane books. He described the poison's effects in meticulous detail, the incredible speed, the creeping paralysis, the way it seemed to simply extinguish the flame of life without leaving a trace. The old botanist listened, his eyes clouded with a distant memory. He did not speak of science, but of stories. He spoke of a legend from his time in the West Indies, a story whispered in fear by the enslaved on the vast sugar plantations. He called it Lagrima de la Noche, the tear of the nightshade. It was not a single plant, Postel explained, his voice low and raspy, but a complex, alchemical concoction of 3, each one harmless, even medicinal on its own. But when combined through a specific secret process of extraction and fermentation, they became something else entirely. A poison so potent it was said to be a physical manifestation of a curse. It was a secret of the Obeah, a powerful spiritual and medicinal tradition that the masters feared, demonized, and sought to eradicate. It was a knowledge, he said, his gaze locking with Thorne's, that was not written in books, but carried in the blood, passed down through generations in the darkness. This was the great revelation, the blinding explosion of truth that shattered the very foundation of the investigation. The weapon was not just poison, it was a piece of cultural memory, an act of ancestral vengeance. The killer was not merely a disgruntled slave, they were a keeper of secrets, a quiet practitioner of a hidden, powerful science. For Magistrate Davis, when Thorne breathlessly relayed this information, it was a key, turning a lock he didn't even know existed. He immediately sent for the Thompson family's slave inventories, the thick, leather-bound ledgers that recorded their human property like livestock. He and Thorne pored over the lists of names, ages, and places of origin, their fingers tracing the faded ink, and there, under the acquisitions from nearly 2 decades prior, they found it. A single, simple entry. Samuel, male, age approx. 10, origin Barbados, the Caribbean, the heart of the Obeah tradition. The climax of this phase of the investigation did not occur in a courtroom or a dark interrogation cell. It happened in the quiet, sun-drenched solitude of the Thompson estate's formal garden. Late one afternoon, the oppressive heat of the day had begun to fade, and the only sound was the gentle buzzing of bees among the roses. Davies had returned to the estate alone. He found Samuel there, tending to the late judge's prized camellias with the same meticulous, unhurried care he applied to everything. The magistrate approached slowly, his footsteps deliberately soft on the fine gravel path. There were no guards, no drawn weapons, only the two of them in the silent garden. For a long, charged moment, the two men stood in silence, separated by a world of power and pain, the white man of law and the enslaved man of secrets. Finally, Davies spoke, his voice quiet, almost conversational, betraying none of the storm of realization within him. "It is a beautiful garden," he said, his gaze sweeping over the perfectly manicured hedges. Judge Thompson was very proud of it. Samuel offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod, not looking up from the flower he was tending. Then Davies drew a breath and asked the question that held the weight of the entire city's fear. A question that was both an accusation and a concession of intellectual defeat. "Tell me, Samuel," he said, his voice perfectly steady. "Have you ever heard of a plant they call the nightshade?" For the first time since the investigation began, Samuel's hands stilled. He did not look up, but his entire body, which had been a study in fluid, constant motion, became a statue carved from silence. The gentle, rhythmic snip of his pruning shears ceased. The air between the two men grew heavy, thick, and charged with unspoken knowledge, in that profound, ringing silence, in that momentary freeze of a man who was otherwise a ghost of perpetual motion. Davies had his answer. It was not a confession spoken aloud, but it was a truth revealed, as clear, as undeniable, and as terrifying as the 12 bodies that had once lain on the veranda just a stone's throw away. That profound, ringing silence in the garden was more damning than any spoken confession. For Magistrate Davies, a man who lived his life by the written word and sworn testimony, this silent admission was a chilling and entirely new form of evidence. It was the truth, not as an utterance, but as an absence, the sudden, deliberate cessation of a lifetime of feigned, invisible subservience. The mask had not been removed, but for a single, terrifying moment. The man behind it had allowed its perfect stillness to reveal the cold, hard face of his soul. Davies drew a slow breath, the sweet scent of roses suddenly feeling funereal and cloying. The authority in his voice was now devoid of any pretense of conversation. It was the pure, unyielding iron tone of the law. "Samuel," he said, his voice cutting through the heavy, humid air, "you are under arrest for the murder of Judge Alistair Thompson and 11 others." Samuel did not resist. He did not flinch. He simply placed his pruning shears carefully on a stone bench, turned, and met the magistrate's gaze for the first time. In his eyes, there was not fear, nor defiance, nor hatred, but the calm, empty finality of a task meticulously and irrevocably completed. The arrest was a quiet, methodical affair, a stark and unsettling contrast to the public hysteria that continued to grip the city. But the search of Samuel's sparse living quarters in the slave cabins behind the main house became the fulcrum upon which the entire case would turn. It was here that the abstract horror of the crime was finally and irrevocably anchored to the world of physical proof. The space was impeccably neat, almost monastic in its simplicity. There was a simple cot with a thin worn blanket, a small wooden crate for his few articles of clothing, and a heavily used Bible. There was little else to suggest the complex, burning inner life of its occupant. But Davies, guided by a new and chilling understanding of his suspect, knew he was not looking for signs of disorder, but of a hidden, meticulous order. He ran his hands along the rough-hewn floorboards, tapping gently, listening. Near the cot, one board sounded different hollow. Using the tip of his knife, he pried it open, tucked away in the dark space beneath. Wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, was Samuel's secret laboratory. It was not a collection of vials and beakers in the European style, but a carefully curated archive of the natural world's deadliest secrets. There were carefully dried bundles of herbs, roots, and flowers, each labeled with small cryptic markings that were meaningless to Davies, but spoke of a deep, ancestral knowledge. There were jars containing dark, viscous liquids and powders ground to a fine, colored dust, and there, in the corner, was a small, heavy mortar and pestle, its stone surface deeply stained with the residue of countless preparations. This was the irrefutable evidence, the tangible, undeniable link between the silent, composed man and the brutal massacre on the veranda. Dr. Aris Thorne was summoned from the city upon examining the contents of the hidden cache. His professional face grew pale, his hands trembling slightly as he handled the specimens. With the old botanist, Postel's descriptions still echoing in his mind, he recognized the components at once. There was the crushed, mottled seed of the castor bean, the dried, deceptively beautiful petals of the oleander flower, and the most crucial element, the gnarled, lethal root of the datura plant, known in the Caribbean as the devil's trumpet. "It's all here, magistrate," Thorne whispered, his voice a mixture of scientific awe and profound, human dread. Each one a potent poison in its own right, but together, they formed the unholy trinity that Postel spoke of. He carefully scraped a minuscule sample from the mortar. Later that night, under the solitary light of his microscope, he would see the same unique, needle-like crystalline structures he had found in the judge's wine decanter. The mystery had been solved. The whispers of folklore and the cold, hard facts of science had converged upon one man. The interrogation of Samuel took place in a small, windowless room in the depths of the city jail. A space of damp stone and shadows, designed to strip a man of all hope and resistance. But Samuel seemed to carry his own profound stillness with him, an aura of impenetrable calm that the stone walls could not penetrate. For hours, he sat in silence as Magistrate Davies laid out the case against him, piece by meticulous, damning piece, the testimony of the survivors, the scientific analysis of the poison, the damning lore of the Obeah tradition, his Caribbean origins, and finally, the contents of the cache found beneath his own floor. When Davies was finished, the evidence hung in the air between them, thick and undeniable. He placed a single dried datura root on the table. "The evidence is absolute," Davies said, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth he had unearthed. All that remains is for you to tell me why." And then, after a long, profound silence, Samuel spoke. His voice, after so long a quietude, was clear, steady, and entirely devoid of the mask of deference it had carried for a lifetime. It was the voice of a man who had already passed judgment on himself and the world, and found the world wanting. His confession was not a plea for mercy, nor was it a cry of remorse. It was a testament. It was the precise and chillingly lucid history of his own soul's slow death, and the methodical, patient planning of his vengeance. He did not speak of a single, grand grievance, but of 1,000 small cuts, a lifetime of accumulated degradations that had hollowed him out until nothing but gold, hard, diamond-like purpose remained. He spoke of the day, 15 years prior, when Judge Thompson had sold his wife, Elara, to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, a place from which no one returned as a casual punishment for a dropped serving tray at a dinner party. He described the look in her eyes, not of anger, but of a deep, soul-shattering despair. He spoke of watching his own son, Marcus, born on the estate, being whipped until his back was raw for the crime of learning to read from pages of a book stolen from the main house library. "The judge said knowledge was a poison for our kind," Samuel stated, his voice flat. "I decided to show him what a real poison looked like." He recounted the names and transgressions of every person who had died on that veranda. Silas Blackwood, the merchant, who had made his fortune in the brutal transatlantic slave trade and had personally branded runaways. Eleanor Vance, the planter's wife, who had ordered a young kitchen girl's hands to be scalded with boiling water for a minor infraction, leaving her permanently scarred. Each name was accompanied by a specific, unforgivable sin, a debt he had recorded in the ledger of his memory. "They called it a celebration of freedom," Samuel said, his eyes finally locking with Davis's, a faint, bitter smile touching his lips. "I simply saw an opportunity to deliver justice, my own justice." He explained the process with the detached precision of a master craftsman. The months of gathering and preparing the components, using the knowledge his grandmother had passed down to him in Barbados. The slow, patient brewing of the poison in the dead of night. A ritual of vengeance. The final, simple act of adding the colorless, odorless liquid to the decanter of wine reserved for the head table. "Their power," he concluded, his voice dropping to a near whisper that filled the small room, "was the power to destroy lives, piece by piece. They never imagined that I had harnessed the power to end them. All at once. A power that grew in the very soil beneath their feet. The full terrifying scope of the act was now revealed. It was not a simple murder. It was a meticulously planned execution. A moral and intellectual reckoning orchestrated by a single, brilliant, and irrevocably broken man. The trial of Samuel was the most sensational event in the history of Charleston, but its outcome was never in doubt. It was not a process of justice, but a piece of raw, visceral civic theater. A brutal and unambiguous reassertion of power by a terrified and enraged elite. The courtroom was packed day after day with the city's white gentry, their faces a mixture of grief, fury, and a new, unsettling fear that they tried to hide behind masks of righteous indignation. Samuel's confession, read aloud by a court clerk, was stripped of all its context and motive, presented not as a response to decades of cruelty, but as the unholy, inexplicable rambling of a demonic monster. He stood silent in the dock throughout the proceedings, his calm, unwavering composure an infuriating affront to the court's authority. Historical accounts from the period record that he was offered no defense, and he asked for none. His silence was his final testimony. The verdict of guilt was a foregone conclusion. and the sentence was delivered with grim, theatrical satisfaction by a new judge. His voice trembling with a mixture of rage and relief, death by hanging. His body to be displayed in the public square as a stark and brutal warning to any who might harbor similar thoughts of rebellion. The execution was a grim, public spectacle, orchestrated to inflict maximum psychological terror. The entire enslaved population of Charleston and the surrounding plantations was forced to attend, to stand in the suffocating summer heat and witness the ultimate prize of defiance. Samuel's death did not bring closure to the city. It only deepened the wound, turning it into a festering, permanent sore. The truth, now fully revealed, had not purged the fear, but had given it a specific, terrifying form. It was the fear that within any of their silent, subservient slaves, there could exist a mind as brilliant, as patient, and as lethal as Samuel's. The comforting, self-serving illusion of the benevolent, paternalistic master and the happy, contented slave was shattered forever. In its place rose a new and far more brutal reality. The aftermath of the poisoning saw the passage of the harshest slave codes in the state's history. Laws were enacted forbidding the enslaved from gathering in groups, from learning to read or write, and from the practice of any traditional medicine, which was now seen as a potential arsenal. The city of Charleston, once a symbol of genteel prosperity, became a fortress under siege from within. The fragile peace that had existed was revealed to be nothing more than the tense, suffocating quiet of a powder keg. And Samuel's act had lit a long, slow-burning fuse. The massacre on the 4th of July was over, but its haunting, bloody legacy had only just begun. In the years that followed, the city of Charleston did not heal. Instead, the societal wounds inflicted by Samuel's act of vengeance festered, creating a culture of even deeper, more institutionalized paranoia that permeated every aspect of life. The collapse was not one of buildings or fortunes, but of the entire social architecture of delusion that had sustained the planter class for generations. The new slave codes, passed in a frenzy of fear and retribution, were not merely laws. They were the tangible manifestation of this new, fear-driven reality. They were a desperate, brutal attempt to legislate against the existence of another Samuel, to extinguish the very possibility of intelligent, organized resistance. The patrols were doubled, their methods more violent, their authority near absolute, now empowered to enter any cabin, at any time, without cause, turning every night into a potential reign of terror. The public whipping post was used with a grim, relentless frequency for infractions as minor as a lingering gaze or a perceived insolent tone. The fragile, hidden culture of the enslaved community was driven further underground. Its songs, once a source of solace and shared identity, were now sung in lower, more sorrowful whispers. Its stories, once a beacon of heritage, were told with a greater sense of peril, lest a child's innocent repetition be overheard. The redefinition of Charleston was complete. It was no longer a city pretending to be a garden of genteel civilization, but an armed camp, constantly at war with the enemy it had created, nurtured, and imprisoned within its own walls. The Thompson estate itself became a physical embodiment of this decay, a sprawling monument to a shattered dynasty. The surviving members of the family, unable to wash the stain of the massacre from its walls or their minds, abandoned the property with a haste that bordered on panic. They sold it for a fraction of its worth to a northern speculator who had no intention of living there, and fled, seeking to escape a past that would forever haunt their name. The grand house, once the epicenter of Charleston society, was left to the mercy of the elements. Its white columns, once symbols of unshakable power, grew stained with green mildew. the paint peeling away like sunburnt skin to reveal the rotting wood beneath. Its magnificent gardens, once Judge Thompson's pride and joy, became a tangled, anarchic wilderness of weeds and thorns, choking the life from the prized camellias Samuel had once so meticulously tended. The windows, shattered by vandals or the fury of coastal storms, stared out like dead, vacant eyes over a city that had lost its innocence. Local children, in hushed, daring tones, invented ghost stories about the property. They whispered that the grounds were haunted, not by the ghosts of the 12 murdered masters, but by the solitary, silent spectre of the man who had served them their final meal, forever tending his phantom garden of poisons. The estate became a taboo place, a monument to a horror so profound that the city chose to let it rot rather than reclaim it. A constant, decaying reminder of the poison that still flowed, unseen, beneath the surface of their lives. Magistrate Elias Davies, the man who had so brilliantly unraveled the mystery, found his life irrevocably altered by it. He had sought truth and found it, but the nature of that truth offered him no comfort, no sense of victory. He had upheld the law, but he was haunted by the profound moral ambiguity of the case, a complexity that the rigid statutes he revered could not contain. He had prosecuted a murderer, yet he could not escape the knowledge that the murderer himself was a victim of a far greater, legally sanctioned crime. Official records state that he continued his service as a magistrate for another decade, but his contemporaries noted a profound, sorrowful change in him. The man of cold, unshakable logic became withdrawn, cynical, and prone to long periods of melancholic silence in his dusty, book-lined study. He drank more heavily. The fine Madeira he once enjoyed now a nightly anesthetic against the ghosts of his own making. His once sharp legal mind seemed to lose its edge, dulled by a truth too complex for the simple binaries of guilt and innocence. He died a bachelor, leaving behind a vast library of legal texts and a single sealed journal which, according to his will, was to be burned unread. The secrets of his final, tormented thoughts on Samuel's justice were lost to the flames. A final act of a man who could no longer bear the weight of the knowledge he possessed. Dr. Aris Thorne, the man of science, was also left with a haunting legacy. The discovery of Samuel's botanical knowledge had opened a door in his mind that he could never again close. The world of medicine he had known, so certain and so European, now seemed incomplete, even arrogant. He became obsessed with the ethnobotany of the region, spending less time in his physician's practice and more time corresponding with men like Abraham Postel, attempting to document the very root work that the new laws sought to eradicate. He saw it not as witchcraft, but as a deep, alternative science, a body of knowledge that European medicine had arrogantly ignored. His work, however, was viewed with deep suspicion by his peers. He was ostracized, his reputation tarnished by his association with what was now considered the forbidden knowledge of the enemy. The greatest secret that remained, the one that gnawed at the heart of the city's fear, was not what Samuel had done, but how many others possessed a similar knowledge. Did he act alone, a solitary genius of vengeance? Or was he part of a silent, invisible network, a hidden chain of knowledge passed from hand to hand in the darkness? This was the question that truly terrified the masters of Charleston, a question to which they would never find an answer. Samuel was dead, but the science he wielded, the ancestral memory he had weaponized, remained alive, a silent, potential threat growing in the swamps and forests just beyond their manicured lawns. So what then is the final legacy of Samuel, the poisoner of Charleston? His name does not appear in the grand histories of the city. which prefer to speak of patriots, planters, and statesmen. His story is a footnote, a dark and disturbing anecdote often dismissed as an anomaly, a singular act of monstrous evil. But to dismiss it as such is to miss the profound and terrifying truth at its core. Was Samuel a monster, or was he the inevitable product of a monstrous system? A man who, having been stripped of all power, all agency, and all humanity, chose to forge a new and terrible kind of power from the only things he had left: his intellect, his memory, and the earth itself. He became the very thing his oppressors feared most, not a simple rebel, but a thinking, planning, and executing instrument of a justice they refused to recognize. The story of the massacre on the 4th of July is a brutal parable, a stark illustration of a timeless and dangerous truth. It reveals the profound blindness of those who wield absolute power, their inability to see the complex, burning humanity of those they oppress. They build their world on the comforting lie of their own superiority and the supposed contentment of their captives, never imagining that the hands that served them their wine could also be measuring their graves. The enduring warning of Samuel's story, then, is not about the danger of a single man. It is about the inherent instability of any society built upon a foundation of profound injustice. It is a reminder that oppression is a form of poison in itself, one that inevitably seeps into the soul of both the master and the slave, corrupting one with arrogance and the other with a rage that, sooner or later, will find its expression. The question, then, is not whether the oppressed will rise up, but in what form that rebellion will take. For when all avenues of justice are closed, and all pleas for mercy fall on deaf ears, justice will sometimes find a new and terrible root growing in the darkness, waiting patiently for its season to bloom.